Good morning, fellow campaigners. Welcome to the International Day of Climate Protest. Now, try 2, 3. Okay, well, we've got a dodgy PA here. Good morning, welcome to the International Day of Climate Protest at Lincoln's Inn Fields. And we have got gorgeous weather today, and it's absolutely fantastic considering the weather so far has been appalling. Thank you very much, everybody that's come so far. It's fantastic. We've had loads of coverage in the media. I hope you all know that. It's been covered on BBC One this morning, and there's been a load of other coverage, especially the Independent Guardian have done a great job for us during the week. That's been fantastic. As you also know, stuff happening in a load of other countries around the world, and about 30 other countries have had having demonstrations today. We already know that Australia, there were 3,500 people out on the streets in Sydney today, and 10,000 people in Australia as a whole. So I think that's worth a first cheer. Hooray! Okay, few domestic items. There's going to be much more kind of serious stuff later on, but just the kind of minor things. Brixton Tea Party is here. They're selling onion soup and stuff like that, and they're at the very far end of this road, furthest away from where I am. Now the march starts basically where I am standing, which is basically behind the greenhouse, and everybody else should be behind the greenhouse. We've got loads of placards that we've brought today, the standard issue kind of Bush, anti-Bush, well, what can I say? The very favourable Bush poster, and they are halfway down this street, and there's a load at the far end of the street. So please pick up some campaign against climate change placards for taking on the march. Thanks very much indeed. And we'll probably a few other announcements, but that's probably it. And I think we've got a lot for now. Thanks a lot.
Yeah,
It'll be very obvious. It's a huge bit.
Yeah, it is going to be obvious.
It's going to be so good. Right. Yeah, so I'll be in that vehicle there the whole time. Obviously, when we get to there, when you get to the gated area, I'll walk just past it, because the last thing you want is a fume-spilling vehicle in the middle of your rally there. So then you can all pour in there, and it's a very large area. Anything else I need to know? Motorcycles. Nick? No Nick? No Nick? No. You should wear more clothes because you're cold.
Where's the
that helmet. if you can. There were no buses, no one chartered any trains. There was no plan to rescue all of those who would remain. All the people with no money, all the people with no wheels, all of those who couldn't hotwire one that they could steal. Thousands and thousands of people abandoned by the state, abandoned by their country, just left to meet their fate. New Orleans, New Orleans, New Orleans.
That was effectively the beginning of the campaign against climate change. Then there was one. Now there are thousands. And in time, we will look back on this day and say, then there were thousands. Now there are tens of thousands. Now there are hundreds of thousands. Now there are millions. Because this will be the greatest political campaign the world has ever seen. It will have to be, because it will be confronting, it is confronting the greatest threat that humanity has ever seen.
Thank you very much, and fantastic to see all of you here. I don't know if you can turn around and you will see that there are still hundreds of people coming in on the other side of the square, and there are going to be thousands here today. Straight into the mic. Well, I thought it was loud enough already. Anyway, everyone highlighting, as Phil has said, the greatest threat facing our planet, that climate change is speeding up and is rapidly reaching the point where many scientists think that it will be irreversible. The Siberian permafrosts are beginning to melt, the Antarctic ice sheet is beginning to break up, the Amazon rainforest is beginning to show early signs of dieback, and I have to say this to President Bush: if he thinks Katrina was bad, I can tell him that there are a lot worse hurricanes on the way if he doesn't change his policy. And the Gulf Stream. And that's why we're all here today, to demand on International Climate Day much tougher action, both at home from the United Kingdom, but also internationally. Demand number one to our negotiators in Montreal next week, that any successor agreement to Kyoto Stage 1 after 2010 has got to include clear targets. It's got to have mechanisms, it's got to have timescales, it's got to be very precise, because without that, any agreement without that is not worth the paper it's written on. Now, I'm well aware that there are some people, and I'm not just thinking of President Bush, who say all we have to do to defeat climate change is business as usual, plus better technology and a bit more R&D. Well, let me say to them, that is utterly, utterly wrong. And that's why we should stop kowtowing to the Americans. Whatever concessions we make to the Bush administration to get them on side, we will never get anything in return, just as we never got anything in return for all of our support over Iraq. The Bush administration has no intention of signing up to any meaningful agreement, and we should stop pandering to the Americans. That's demand number one. Demand number two. Kyoto was a good start, 5% cut in CO2 by 2010. But what the scientists tell us is necessary is a 60% cut, a 60% cut by 2050 if we're going to stop global warming. So I say to our negotiators that you've got to aim for a reduction in climate change emissions of 25% by 2025. That is the minimum to be on our way towards what the scientists say is necessary. Now, I know that's going to be very difficult, But let's face it, climate change doesn't hang about waiting for the politicians to come to an agreement. Governments aren't in the driving seat, climate change is. And we should aim not for what happens to be convenient to governments, but what avoidance of climate change disaster makes absolutely necessary. 25% cut, that's the target. Demand number 3. Bring air travel back into the I would say back into, because it's never been in it, into the Kyoto Protocol. It was the Americans who said that air travel should be pushed to one side. Well, I tell you this, air travel is the single fastest rising cause of greenhouse gas emissions. And governments cannot say, as some are, that we're going to make a priority of dealing with climate change, but at the same time we're going to sanction a 5-fold increase in air travel over the next 30 years. It just doesn't add up. What we've got to do is bring in a cap and trade system and force the airline companies to cut their emissions. Nuclear is more expensive. Nuclear has generated 10,000 tons of undisposed of. It's an obvious major terrorism risk. Nuclear always has cancer and leukemia clusters around every nuclear power station. And I say this, the risk of catastrophic accident, however small it may be, can never entirely be ruled out. We need nuclear like a hole in the head. We have more wind power capacity around these islands of ours on our offshore off the continent than the whole of the rest of Europe put together. And it's about time we use those resources to the full. Renewables are the answer. And demand number 5, this is my last one. Using, and I say this deliberately, of oil is in the Middle East, the Caspian and elsewhere is just about the worst possible policy on every single count. It has created a horrendous humanitarian disaster in Iraq. It will lead to more wars when what the world wants is more peace. And it will create a global warming turbo. The world knows, we all know, they're still streaming in. Tens of thousands, millions, as Phil said, of people in this country know that there is a better way. And that's what we have come here today to demand. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Now, next up we have for you a woman who I suspect might be even better known with slight...
Well, it's great to see so many of you here. And this is easily the largest ever demonstration against climate change in this country. So good on you for being here. Now, we're gathered here outside the US Embassy because George Bush's refusal to act on climate change makes him guilty of crimes against humanity. But if George Bush is guilty, let's not forget that our own Prime Minister Tony Blair is a very active accomplice in that crime as well. And so we've got a message for Tony Blair, and our message is very clear. That climate change is a far greater threat than international terrorism. Climate change is itself a weapon of mass destruction. And that if Tony Blair had spent a fraction of the resources and commitment that he spent on an illegal war in Iraq, instead on tackling climate change, then we might genuinely have a chance of a safer world. And so we demand immediate and urgent action now. Because this is a Prime Minister who says that climate change is the biggest threat that we face. He says he's going to show global leadership on it. Well, he'd better get his domestic house in order first. Because under this Prime Minister and this government, greenhouse gas emissions have risen, not fallen. This is a Prime Minister who personally intervened in a row between the Environment Ministry and the Trade Ministry. And he intervened in the row on the side of big business to allow them to emit more greenhouse gas emissions. This is a Prime Minister under whom aviation capacity is going to see a huge expansion and who is embarking on a massive road building programme. Well, this doesn't look like international leadership to me. Because the reality of climate change is a devastating one, and it's one that will hurt the poorest people hardest. Yet it's a reality that we are sleepwalking towards because most people and almost all politicians are in a state of denial. The targets set by governments or by the Kyoto Protocol are hopelessly inadequate. Even worse, our own government seems to have given up even on the idea of targets. Tony Blair was quoted a few weeks ago as saying that legally binding targets make people nervous and worried. Well, we have news for you, Tony Blair. The absence of legally binding targets makes a lot more people a lot more nervous and a lot more worried. Even more astonishingly, Margaret Beckett has called targets imperialist. Well, the real imperialism is for the rich countries to carry on with business as usual, knowing that the poorest countries will pay the price for our livelihoods with their lives and the lives of their children. And under contraction and convergence, and let's give a huge round of applause for that banner over there for contraction and convergence, because that is the way forward. Contraction and convergence is about a fair and equitable way of making cuts in greenhouse gas emissions in a way that the poorest countries don't suffer from it. That is the way we have to follow, and nationally we need a system of domestic carbon allocations as well, so that all of us have a domestic carbon allocation and quota. Because to make cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, not of 60%, but of the 80 or 90% that we need, we'll need nothing short of a revolution of our economies, a revolution of our planning system, our transport system, of the way in which we produce and consume. But watch my lips, Tony Blair, that does not mean nuclear power. Those of us who have campaigned against the war on Iraq will find something strangely familiar about the tactics being used to persuade us that nuclear is necessary. First, we have the contrived panic over energy prices and gas supply. That's followed by a series of Downing Street's anonymous briefings. And now the energy review, this dodgy dossier full of misleading statements and lies designed to give Blair the pretext he needs to implement a policy on nuclear that he's already decided upon. And just like the invasion of Iraq, the energy review will be used like the dodgy dossier to take us down the nuclear road. And so a message for Tony Blair is simple. Nuclear power is uneconomic, it's unsafe, it's unpopular, and it's unnecessary. If nuclear power is the answer, it must have been a very stupid question. Because the solutions are clear. The European Union could save around 40% of its primary energy demand through efficiency measures alone. Half of our remaining energy needs could be met by renewables by 2050. And yet, it's true that technical fixes will not be enough. We need a completely different economic system, based not on ever-increasing economic growth, but on meeting people's real needs. And there are compelling reasons to go in that direction, because the global peak in oil production is likely to occur sooner than many expect. Some think it could be happening now or in just a few short years. But whether it's 5 years away or 25 years away, it's clear that we have to end our addiction to oil. Because with oil prices set to rise, the likelihood of further wars and conflict over oil increases. A large-scale switch to renewables is a move towards peace and away from the chaos and conflict which oil exploration brings with it. And so our message is no to the human rights abuses that go with oil exploration, no to oil wars. Let me just finish by saying that some people say that demonstrations like this make a difference. There was even an article in yesterday's Guardian suggesting we should do better by staying at home. Well, our message to that is this, that yes, personal action is important, but we need the political framework with the legal binding targets that will mean everybody moves in that direction. So it is crucially important that you're here today. We'll go on fighting this one until we succeed. Good on you for being here, and we will make a difference. Thank you.
And climate justice for everybody. Congratulations again. See you here again whenever we're needed. Bye.
Hello once, and that's it really. Thank you, John. Now, climate change is a subject, an issue, a threat that touches us in our common humanity. The wind and the waves have no respect for our differences of politics, creed, colour, any such human cultural divisions. They are irrelevant.
It's one of the many symptoms of the suicidal assault mounted by the human species on the natural world. We know of lots of other things that we are suffering from, and I'm told that each one of us have about 200 poisons in our body which our grandparents didn't have. This is all part of the rat race, and we are being manipulated every day by the global corporations. The problem is systemic. The process has been to colonize, monetize, and then globalize. It is economics based on civilizations were biodegradable. This one is not, because archaeologists excavating future civilizations will be wearing radiation suits. In terms of the historical epoch, the human species, the events that created our present global predicaments had occurred only in the twinkling of an eye. This may sound wonderful to some, but the price we have to pay is heavy. That's why.
Sorry? We've all heard what you've said about climate change, that it is a major threat. But then you also say that we have to face political realities. Well, let the laws of the universe bow to your political realities. Let physics and chemistry modify their laws to fit in with your God of economic growth. And let polar bears learn to love living in zoos as we sacrifice their habitat on the altar of unfettered consumption. Stop and think about it, Tony. Believe it or not, economic growth is not God. We have bowed to this idol for long enough. Now is the time to look at how our beautiful world works and to have the humility to fit into it and stop pushing it beyond its limits in an attempt to satisfy our toddler mindset that we want it all and we want it all now. It is time for the human race to grow up, and we need you, Tony, to help us do that. And it is possible. Studies have shown that we can cut our UK emissions by 60%. We can do it without waiting around for new technology. We can do it without nuclear power. All we need from you is serious, and I mean serious, investment in renewables and energy efficiency, and the vision, moral leadership and courage to break our culture's addiction to energy. And at At Montreal, Tony, we need you to negotiate a binding treaty that contracts our global emissions to a safe level and converges all countries to equal per capita emissions. Go for that safe binding target. Go for it as if your own children's lives depend upon it. And I also have a message for President Bush. I too call myself a Christian. But the God I worship is more important to me than the economy. The Jesus I follow came down to this earth to redeem the whole of creation, to demonstrate its preciousness. How can you think it's okay to destroy the earth? And the Jesus I follow calls me to love my neighbour as myself, where that neighbour is from another race, of another country, fallen upon harder times than myself. President Bush, your neighbour is a child in Bangladesh, losing his home and his land to sea level rise. And you, as an average American, will have contributed 100 times as much CO2 to the cause of that sea level rise. This is injustice on a huge scale, and the Bible I've got talks a lot about justice. Okay. The Bishop of London, Richard Chartres, says, the effects of climate change are already being felt by the poor and vulnerable throughout the world. Anyone who believes that a bias to the poor...
Please put a big welcome together to Norman Baker, the Liberal Democrat Environment Spokesman. Norman Baker!
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming along today. Every time I come along here, there's more people than there were the previous year. But sadly, the reason for that is inaction or obstacles from that building next to us. It's not just the concrete blocks and the fences and the police officers that are separating us from the US Embassy. It's a whole philosophy. This area is full of people who want to tackle climate change, who recognise the dangers, who recognise the... Released, and at that point, a vicious cycle kicks in. There isn't a lot of time to be running around, pretending to do something as Mr. Blair is, and not achieving very much. We don't have the...
Global campaign. Because if you want to see the present, you need only look at New Orleans. What you saw in New Orleans was climate change, but you saw it in the societies we live in. And what you saw was the utter rottenness of the society that is dominated by that screaming eagle over there, that is dominated by empire. What you saw was the army being sent in to their own country, to their own people, with machine guns, parading past old women in wheelchairs with their hands held out, doing nothing for those women. That is what climate change means now. But if you want to know what climate change is going to mean, look at what is happening in northern Pakistan. That earthquake has nothing to do with climate change. And it killed 75,000 people, but more than 100,000 people are starting to die in the cold now because their government and military dictatorship will do nothing for them, because the governments of the world will do nothing for them. That is what will happen with climate change. Climate change will affect the crops. And when the crops fall, in this country, food will be more expensive. And in many countries of the world, millions of people will die of famine. Climate change will mean tens of millions and hundreds of millions of refugees. I can imagine a world in which refugees are welcomed into new countries. But in this world, refugees meet borders and men and women with machine guns. And the refugee camps, the tents, stretch for miles and for years and years. And climate change will mean war. We are living through the wars for oil now. Wait until you see the wars for water. We must stop all of this, and we can. We have the technology now. We need a massive global New Deal. We need every house in this country insulated. We need trains, not planes. We need to ban the cars in cities. We need that, not just in this country and in America. We need it in every country in the world. We need a massive global New Deal. We need to make poverty history by building windmills in every country in the world so that every country in the world can have clean industrialization. And if my son was fighting in Iraq, I would far, far rather he was building a windmill in South Africa. To do that, nuclear power is not the answer. The reason that Bush loves nuclear power, the reason that Blair loves nuclear power, is they want nuclear bombs. And without nuclear power, there are no nuclear bombs. I'm fighting to save the planet. And nuclear weapons are the same kind of threat to the planet that climate change is. Only nuclear weapons can do it in 2 hours. Nuclear is not the answer. Massive wind, massive solar power, massive renewable energy, that is the answer. And to make them act, we have to have global agreements. We have to say to all of the politicians of this world, either you do it or you get out of our way and we will replace you. To do that, we have to build a movement. We have to build a movement that will make the massive Stop the War movement around the globe look tiny. We have to build a movement that will save this planet. We have to come back next year in more countries, in every country bigger, and the year after that in more countries and in every country bigger, until we have built a movement that can change the world and save the planet we live on.
I think we're in for a bit of a treat. It is a very, very great pleasure indeed. I introduce to you a man I believe to be one of the finest orators of his generation. The man who doesn't go for that easy, quick, you know, quote. No, 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 no. If you want a man who can work a stage, who can speak in public, please, please welcome our very own honorary president, Jolly Green George himself, Mr. Monbiot!
Thanks for that. I feel I'm set up to fail. I'd like to start by reminding us of where we have come from. For the first 3 million years of human history, we were entirely dependent on the whims of the environment. Like all other animal species, we lived in fear, almost constant fear, of starvation, of predation, of weather, of disease. For the following few thousand years, when we had discovered the rudiments of agriculture and of crop storage, our global food security began to increase somewhat, began to improve. We disposed of most of our predators, but we were ruled by the sword, the axe, and the spear. Our conflicts were fought mostly over land. Over land, not just because that's where our food came from, and food was almost always short or threatening to be short, but also because that's where our energy came from. That's where our horses and our bullocks grazed, which we used for traction. That's where our fuel grew, in the form of wood and the form of crop wastes. And then we discovered fossil fuels. And when we discovered fossil fuels, everything changed. Suddenly, there was a surplus. Suddenly, the economy could start growing as it hadn't grown before. Suddenly, the people who'd been expelled from the land during the previous era's disputes and conflicts could find employment in the growing cities and the growing industries. Having done so, they were able to mobilize against power for the first time. They were able to force the despots who had ruled their lives to loosen their grip on power. And though fossil fuels also ushered in an era of warfare of a horror that had never been contemplated before, they made the need for war less pressing than it was before. Because for the first time in human history, indeed for the first time in biological history, we had a net surplus of energy. That does not occur in nature. It had never occurred before. This is an extraordinary moment. A moment in which we live with a net surplus of energy, made possible by fossil fuels. Agricultural productivity rose because of fossil fuels by 10 or 20 times. Economic productivity rose by 100 times. And everything we see around us is a product of that. The fact that we have assembled here today is possible only because of fossil fuels. The fact that we have not been cut down by the yeomanry, or not yet at any rate, is only because of fossil fuels. Our freedom, our prosperity, our luxury, they all result from fossil fuels. Ours are the most fortunate generations that have ever lived. Ours are also the most fortunate generations that ever will. I don't have to remind you of the two forces which are currently converging on our lives. The first is that the source of energy which is hardest to replace, more or less impossible to replace, and I mean liquid fossil fuels. That source of energy is now running out. The second, of course, is that the consequences of the fossil fuel burning that has brought us here today are now being visited on us. And everything around us, all this that seems so solid, that we took for granted, that we just lived with and expected always to live with, that was seen as non-negotiable, suddenly looks contingent. All this begins to look like a great tottering pile balanced on a ball that's about to start rolling downhill. Now, we've heard something about the sort of cuts which people would like to see. I'm not interested in cuts that people would like to see. I'm interested in the cuts that science tells us are necessary. And those cuts do not equate to 20% of our current carbon use by 2020. They do not equate to 60% of our current carbon use by 2050. No one will thank me for saying this, but the science is now unequivocal. We need a 90% cut by 2030. That is the only way we have of preventing this whole thing, this whole edifice balanced on a ball, from crashing down around us. And the reason for that is clear. If we do not cut carbon by 90% by 2030, then carbon emissions in the atmosphere reach 430 parts per million. And that is the point at which, unequivocally, most of the world's major ecosystems go into positive feedback. The biosphere becomes a net source of carbon dioxide. And then the game is out of our hands. It has got nothing to do with us anymore because there's nothing we can do to stop it. The ecosystems upon which we have relied to absorb carbon dioxide, they start producing it. We have 25 years, ladies and gentlemen, in which to act, and not just to act a little bit. We have 25 years in which to cut carbon emissions throughout our economy, the developed world economy, by 90%. Now, there are some people who believe that this can be done by replacing the fossil fuels on which this great tottering pile has been built entirely with ambient sources of energy. And that, I'm afraid, is in the realm of science fiction. Yes, there's plenty out there. There's plenty of wind and wave and sunlight which we're not tapping. But every year we use the stored sunlight from 400 years of accumulation. Every year, 400 years worth of sunlight. And we simply cannot plug in our contingent ambient energy which exists at any one time into the current grid, into our current energy use patterns, and expect life to carry on as it has carried on before. The only way in which the sort of cut that I am talking about can be brought about is through a massive cut in the amount of energy we use. Yes, there are some techno fixes. There are probably sufficient techno fixes to allow us, if we're going to have a 90% cut in carbon, to get away with more or less a 50% cut in energy. But a 50% cut in energy, that is one hell of a demand. We are talking not just about changing the fact that you can go fly off for 39 quid to Seville for a weekend. We are talking about changing the very basis of the way in which you and I and all of us live.
Yeah.
If this problem,
let's do it.
If this problem could be solved by slagging off George Bush, we would have solved it by now. And of course, we have to solve it partly by slagging off George Bush. But the problem does not stop with him. The problem does not stop with the US. The problem does not stop with our own government. The problem does not stop with those other people who are flying and driving and leaving their windows open while their heating is on. The problem also stops with every one of us. We are confronting something which no mass political movement has ever even attempted to confront before. In the past, all the mass movements which have assembled because of fossil fuels, which have been allowed to exist in the democratic space created by fossil fuels, have called for more. People riot for more. People have not rioted for austerity. Never in human history have people rioted for austerity. Uniquely, we have gathered here with the help of our more to call for less. We, unlike any mass political movements which have gone before us, are calling for less of the things which have allowed this extraordinary outpouring of wealth and luxury that all of us have enjoyed. And we are calling for that not just from our governments, not just from each other, but also extraordinarily from ourselves. We recognise that that cut requires rationing. There's no other way in which it can possibly be done. Otherwise, all that will happen is the rich carry on using their fantastic profligate quantities of fossil fuel while the poor are left with none. There has to be rationing and distribution within our own economies, and there has to be rationing and distribution around the world. We need global contraction and convergence. So we are not only calling for something which nobody has ever called for before. We are calling for something which is incredibly hard to achieve because it requires a mass global mobilization, which then requires mobilization from virtually everyone who is politically capable, who has the political space to act on Earth. So while we're engaged in something big today, we're going to have to be engaged in something one heck of a lot bigger tomorrow. And when I say tomorrow, I don't mean 2050, I mean tomorrow. But this unique historical fight at this unique historical moment, an interlude between ecological constraint and ecological catastrophe, this interlude in which the most fortunate generations ever live, requires an extraordinary effort of confronting everything. I just want to leave you with this one thought. We are not just fighting against George Bush, but we are fighting against George Bush. We are not just fighting against the United States, but we are fighting against the United States. We are not just fighting against Tony Blair, but we are fighting against Tony Blair. But the biggest fight of all, in which we are engaged, is not a fight against the US, Tony Blair, or anyone else. It is a fight against what we have become. It is a fight against our own inherent tendencies to desire and consume and grab more and more and more. The biggest fight of our lives, ladies and gentlemen, the biggest fight of our lives is not out there, it is in here. Thank you very much.
Difficult words, a brave man to say that. Not everybody may agree, but let's hear it for the bravery. That is a strong thing to say. Okay, last.